Fort Mifflin sits on Mud Island at the confluence of the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, just south of Philadelphia, and it has been sitting there in various states of construction, ruin, reconstruction, and managed decay since the British began building on that ground in 1771. The island itself is older than the fort, older than the colonial presence, older than any European notation of this particular bend in the river, and it has the quality of low, marshy land everywhere, the quality of having absorbed a great deal without releasing it. The Delaware comes down from the north carrying whatever the watershed has given it, and at Mud Island the current slows slightly as the two rivers meet, and things settle. Silt settles, and, over the course of a century and a half of military occupation, other things settled too. The fort's official history is one of the more dramatic in the American Revolutionary record. In the autumn of 1778, a small garrison of Continental soldiers, estimates range from 200 to 400 men at various points during the siege, held Fort Mifflin against the British Navy for 6 weeks. The British needed the fort taken so that their ships could move supplies up the Delaware to their forces occupying Philadelphia. The Continental garrison needed the fort held long enough for Washington's army at Valley Forge to survive the coming winter without having to fight on a second front. The British brought warships. They brought a floating battery. They brought cannon that could fire from angles the fort's designers had not anticipated. And they fired them continuously for days at a time, reducing the fort's brick and timber walls to something that eyewitness accounts describe as resembling a field of broken teeth. By the time the garrison evacuated in November, the fort had absorbed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 cannon rounds, and the men who had held it were, by every account, not in the condition they had been in September. What that autumn left behind in the ground at Mud Island was considerable. The dead of a 6-week artillery siege do not get careful burials. They get whatever the circumstances allow, which in the autumn of 1778 meant mass graves dug in the soft riverine soil of the island, in some cases in a great hurry, and then covered and left. The British occupied Philadelphia for another year before evacuating it, and by the time American forces returned to Mud Island to begin rebuilding the fort in the 1790s, the graves were already unmarked. The island had flooded at least twice in the intervening years. Things had moved in the way that things in saturated soil near rivers move, laterally, downward, redistributed by water and freeze and thaw and the slow insistence of gravity. The fort was substantially rebuilt between 1795 and 1815, and then rebuilt again in the 1830s, and garrisoned and re-garrisoned through the Civil War, during which it served primarily as a military prison, a detail that added its own layer of mortality to the island's accumulated dead. Confederate prisoners were held there in conditions that period accounts describe, with varying degrees of candor depending on who was doing the describing. Union records tend toward the bureaucratic and imprecise. What can be said with confidence is that people died at Fort Mifflin during the Civil War years, in numbers that were not trivial, and that they were buried on or near the island, and that their burials were no more meticulously documented than those of the Revolutionary-era dead they joined in the ground. The island's soil has a particular quality that anyone who has spent time near the lower Delaware will recognize. It is dark and dense with organic material, saturated in the way that land at the edge of tidal rivers tends to be saturated, not always wet, but never fully dry, holding moisture at a depth that discourages certain kinds of decomposition while accelerating others. Bone survives well in such conditions, provided it is below the zone of most active biological activity. And in the lower sections of Mud Island, the water table sits close enough to the surface that burials made even a foot or two down can enter a semi-anaerobic environment within a generation. This is relevant to what was found in 1901 because it explains how bones buried in some cases more than a century before could have survived in a condition legible enough for a non-medical observer to record measurements and note comparisons. They were not fragments. The report's language implies completeness. These were bones that had been kept, by the particular chemistry of the island, in something approaching their original integrity, held in the dark and the damp like objects that had simply been waiting to be accounted for. By the late 19th century, Fort Mifflin had declined from active military significance. The Army still maintained a presence there, but the fort's strategic importance had been eclipsed by the changing nature of warfare and the development of newer installations. It became, in the language of military bureaucracy, a secondary facility, a place that was retained not because it was actively needed, but because disposing of it raised questions that were easier to defer. Work crews were periodically sent to perform maintenance, to reinforce crumbling walls, to drain sections of the grounds that flooded seasonally, and to address whatever the most recent inspection had identified as most urgently requiring attention. It was during one of these maintenance episodes, in the spring of 1901, that workers excavating a drainage channel in the southwestern quadrant of the fort's interior grounds broke through the roof of something that had not appeared on any of the fort's extant plans. What they found below the disturbed soil was a vaulted brick chamber, roughly 30 feet long and perhaps 12 feet wide at its widest point, its arched ceiling constructed with a precision that suggested deliberate and skilled masonry rather than expedient wartime construction. The chamber was not empty. The foreman of the work crew, a man named Callahan, whose first name does not appear in the surviving documentation, stopped the excavation immediately and sent word to the fort's commanding officer, a Captain Aldrich, who came to look and then sent word to the Army's Department of the East in Philadelphia. An officer was dispatched, arrived 2 days later, examined the chamber, and wrote a report. That report exists in partial form in the National Archives, though several pages of it appear to have been removed at some point and have not been located. What remains describes the chamber in measured official language and records its contents with the kind of careful imprecision that official documents adopt when those writing them are not entirely certain what they are looking at. The chamber contained bones, a great many bones, arranged in a manner that the report's author described as both deliberate and unusual. The bones were stacked, in the way that an ossuary stores bones, long bones together, skulls together. The remains of many individuals organized by type rather than by individual. This was not a mass grave in the ordinary sense, where bodies are interred whole and in proximity. This was something done after decomposition, after someone had gathered what remained and made decisions about how it should be kept. An ossuary, in other words, a bone house. The deliberate repository of the dead, constructed with enough architectural care that its vault had held for well over a century without significant collapse. The skulls were noted specifically in the report. The noting of them was, in retrospect, the most consequential part of the document, because the language the officer used was careful in a way that suggested he had looked at them more than once and thought about them before writing. He recorded that the skulls appeared uniformly to be of unusual size. He used the phrase markedly larger than standard, and then, in a parenthetical that feels like a man arguing with himself in writing, noted that he was not a medical officer and that a medical opinion would be required before any conclusion could be drawn. A measurement was recorded in the report for at least some of the skulls, 14 inches in cranial circumference. Though it is worth noting here that cranial measurements recorded in this period were not always consistent in their methodology, and whether this figure represents circumference, diameter, or some other dimension is not made unambiguous by the surviving text. A medical officer was dispatched. His report, if he wrote one in formal terms, has not been located. There is a brief mention of his visit in a subsequent administrative document, which notes that he examined the chamber and its contents, and that his findings were communicated verbally to Captain Aldrich. Whatever he said verbally was apparently not transcribed, or was transcribed in the missing pages, or was communicated in a separate document that has not survived or has not been made accessible. What happened next is documented, though the reasoning behind it is not. In the late spring of 1902, approximately 13 months after the chamber's discovery, a construction crew arrived at Fort Mifflin with materials that included a substantial quantity of Portland cement and hydraulic lime. They spent several days on the grounds. The work they performed was recorded in a maintenance log as sealing of subsurface drainage anomaly, southwest quadrant. When they left, the chamber was sealed. Concrete had been poured over the original brick vault and the access point that the 1901 drainage crew had opened, and then the surface had been graded and covered, and the area returned to its previous appearance. No bones were removed. No skulls were removed. Nothing was taken out before the sealing. This is inferable from the maintenance log's language, which describes the work as sealing rather than clearing, and from the absence of any inventory or accession record at any museum, university, or medical institution from this period that would correspond to the receipt of skeletal material from Fort Mifflin. The chamber was sealed with its contents intact. The decision deserves to be understood in the context of what was being asked of the Army's institutional apparatus. By 1902, the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology had been cataloging and collecting human remains from indigenous sites across the country for 2 decades, with a thoroughness that later generations would characterize more honestly. Anatomists at Eastern universities maintained collections of skulls and skeletons gathered from various sources, some documented and some not. The culture around the study of human remains in this period was acquisitive in ways that would later require legislative correction. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 was, in part, a response to a century of institutional collection without consent or accountability. For the Army to have turned the Fort Mifflin skulls over to a university or a museum in 1902 would have been entirely consistent with the practices of the period. That this apparently did not happen, that the chamber was instead sealed with the bones still inside, suggests either that something about those bones made the usual channels seem inappropriate, or that the decision-making was driven more by institutional self-protection than by the scientific enthusiasm that would have otherwise been the expected response. To understand why this requires dwelling on what the 1901 discovery represented in the context of the fort's history, and what the men who made the decision to seal it rather than excavate it may have been thinking, or, more precisely, what they may have been trying not to think about. Fort Mifflin, by 1901, had been accumulating its dead for 130 years. The Revolutionary garrison, the Civil War prisoners, the unnamed others who had died during the various periods of occupation and whose deaths were recorded, if at all, in documents that were themselves poorly preserved. The Army's institutional relationship with its own historical dead was, in this period, deeply uncomfortable. The late 19th century had seen significant effort put into the identification and reinterment of Civil War dead. The establishment of national cemeteries, the organization of the remains of battlefield dead, but this effort was primarily concerned with the recent and the nameable. The Revolutionary dead were a different matter. They were old enough to be historical rather than personal, and they were, in most cases, thoroughly unidentifiable. What do you do with an ossuary of bones that have been organized by an unknown hand at an unknown time for reasons that are not recorded? The Army's answer, apparently, was to pour concrete over it and write in the maintenance log that a drainage anomaly had been addressed. The skull measurements are the part of this story that has attracted the most attention over the years, and also the part that most requires care in the telling. 14 inches, recorded by a non-medical officer in 1901 with uncertain methodology, representing an unknown number of skulls from an unknown population in an unknown state of preservation, is not a measurement that supports the conclusions it is often recruited to support in the more excitable corners of historical and pseudo-scientific inquiry. A 14-inch cranial circumference, if that is indeed what was measured, would represent a skull substantially larger than the modern human average, but it would not be without precedent in conditions of disease, injury, or genetic variation. Hydrocephalus, for instance, can produce enlarged cranial vaults. Paget's disease, which causes bones to grow abnormally, is more common in populations of Northern European descent. Post-mortem bone changes, particularly in conditions of saturation and desiccation cycling over many decades, can alter cranial dimensions in ways that are not straightforwardly interpretable without careful forensic analysis. None of that forensic analysis was performed because the bones were sealed under concrete a year after their discovery. What remains is the record of a decision, the decision to seal rather than study, to cover rather than document, and the question of what that decision was made in response to. The most conservative interpretation is administrative inertia and military discomfort with the prospect of excavating a mass grave that contained, potentially, the remains of men who had died in service and whose families or descendants might have claims or opinions about the matter. The late 19th century army was not notably sensitive to such concerns, but neither was it eager to invite the kind of public attention that a discovery of this kind, once publicized, would have generated. Philadelphia newspapers had demonstrated, in the preceding decades, a robust appetite for sensational history, and Fort Mifflin's revolutionary credentials would have made any find there a front-page story. There is also the matter of the organized arrangement of the bones. An ossuary is not the natural result of a mass grave. Someone made the chamber. Someone, at some point after the deaths that produced the remains, gathered bones, organized them, and placed them in a constructed space with a vaulted brick ceiling. This required intention, skill, time, and a reason. The Revolutionary-era dead at Mud Island were buried by soldiers under combat conditions. They did not receive the treatment that an ossuary represents. Whatever the chamber contained, and whenever it was assembled, the assembly happened after the initial burials and required a second deliberate act. There is one other thing worth noting about the timing. The year 1901 was the same year that the Army Corps of Engineers completed a major survey of the Delaware River Channel south of Philadelphia, a survey that produced detailed maps of Mud Island and its surrounding waterways, conducted in preparation for a proposed dredging project intended to improve navigation. The survey team worked the river for much of that spring, and their presence near the island overlapped by several weeks with the period during which the drainage crew made their discovery. What is clear is that the dredging project the survey was preparing for was quietly canceled the following year, and the cancellation notice in the Corps of Engineers records gives as its reason an unspecified change in navigational priorities. It may mean nothing. It may mean that someone with knowledge of what sat beneath the southwest quadrant made a quiet call to someone with the authority to cancel a project that would have brought heavy equipment and curious eyes to the riverbank directly adjacent to a sealed bone vault. Or coincidence, the kind history produces in quantity and the human mind tends to connect into patterns. The fort's records from the late 18th and early 19th century are incomplete. The periods of reconstruction in the 1790s and 1830s are documented well enough to give a general picture, but not well enough to rule out the construction. during one of those periods, of a subterranean chamber for the organized reinterment of remains that had been disturbed by building work. This is the most mundane explanation for the ossuary's existence, and it is also a plausible one. But it does not explain, if this was a deliberate and organized reinterment, why no record of it was made, or why the chamber was not noted on any of the fort's subsequent plans, or why the bones were organized with the precision the 1901 report describes, rather than simply reburied in a more conventional way. Fort Mifflin is still there. It operates today as a historic site managed by a nonprofit preservation organization under a long-term lease from the city of Philadelphia, which acquired the property from the federal government in the 1980s. Tours are conducted. Events are held. The fort has a reputation among people interested in such things as one of the more reliably uncanny historic properties in the Philadelphia region, and the stories told about it by various paranormal investigators and local historians are numerous and not always distinguishable from each other. The chamber in the southwest quadrant, sealed in 1902, has not been reopened. Whether it is known about by the current site managers is unclear from publicly available information. Whether the concrete poured in 1902 is still intact, or whether more than a century of Mud Island's characteristic dampness has done to it what Mud Island does to everything, is likewise unclear. What is clear is that somewhere beneath the graded surface of the fort's southwest quadrant, behind concrete that was mixed and poured by men who were following orders they did not fully understand, there is a vaulted brick chamber containing the organized remains of an unknown number of people, some of whom appear to have had skulls of unusual dimension, all of whom were placed there by hands that were careful enough to build a proper vault and knowledgeable enough to organize what they were keeping. The chamber has been there, sealed and undisturbed, for more than 120 years. The bones in it have been there longer. The Delaware comes down from the north and meets the Schuylkill just south of Mud Island, and the current slows at the confluence the way it always has, and things settle into the riverine silt the way they always have. The island holds what it has been given. The fort holds what it was given too, in the particular way that sealed concrete holds things, completely, and without comment, and with the specific patience of something that was never intended to be opened again.